In 2001, two American honeymooners vanished without a trace while backpacking through the remote villages of Eastern Europe. James and Peter Rodriguez had been married just 3 weeks earlier in a small ceremony in San Francisco, embarking on what they called their dream honeymoon, a month-long journey through Prague, Budapest, and the smaller communities that dotted the countryside between. They were last seen leaving their hotel in Prague's Old Town on a crisp October morning, their green backpacks slung over their shoulders, excited about a day trip to explore traditional villages they had read about in a guidebook. But 12 years later, construction workers building a new bridge over the Vltava River made a discovery that would finally shed light on what happened to the young couple, uncovering evidence so disturbing that it would force authorities to confront a truth they had spent over a decade trying to bury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. James Rodriguez and Peter Castellanos had met 4 years earlier at the Victoria Theater in San Francisco's Mission District, where a local community theater group was staging a production of Our Town. James, then 24 and working as a freelance graphic designer while pursuing his dream of becoming a professional photographer, had volunteered to design the set. Peter, 22 and in his final year of education studies at San Francisco State, was volunteering as an usher to fulfill community service requirements for his teaching credential. Their first conversation happened during a particularly chaotic tech rehearsal when a backdrop James had designed fell over during a scene change. Peter, who had been watching from the back of the theater, rushed to help him prop it back up. As they worked together to secure the heavy canvas, James found himself charmed by Peter's easy laugh and the way he immediately jumped in to help. Without being asked, I knew right then, James would tell friends later. Here was this guy who didn't even know me, and he was crawling around on the floor of a dusty theater, helping me fix my mistakes. And he was making jokes the whole time, keeping everyone's spirits up. I thought, this is someone I want in my life. Peter's version of their meeting was equally romantic, but characteristically focused on others. James was so focused, so passionate about getting everything perfect, he would recall. But he wasn't stressed or demanding like some artists can be. He genuinely cared about making something beautiful for everyone else to enjoy. I could see how much he loved what he was doing, and I wanted to be part of that kind of passion. They went for coffee after that rehearsal, then dinner the following weekend, then began spending most of their free time together. James introduced Peter to photography, taking him on long walks through San Francisco neighborhoods where James would capture images of daily life, architecture, and the small moments of beauty that most people overlooked. Peter shared his love of working with children, often bringing James to school events where James would take pictures of Peter's students performing in plays or science fairs. Their relationship deepened through shared adventures and complementary personalities. James's methodical, artistic nature balanced perfectly with Peter's spontaneous warmth and social ease. Friends described them as a couple who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who could be silly together but also support each other through challenges. Maria Rodriguez, James's mother, had initially been concerned when her son came out to her during his sophomore year of college. A devout Catholic who had raised James and his two sisters as a single mother after her husband's death, she struggled to reconcile her religious beliefs with her love for her son. However, meeting Peter had transformed her perspective entirely. Peter was like the son I had always wished I could have for my daughters, Maria remembered years later. He was kind, respectful, funny, and he obviously adored James. He would call me every few weeks just to chat, not because James asked him to, but because he genuinely wanted to maintain a relationship with me. He remembered my birthday, asked about my work, and always made me laugh when I was feeling stressed. Peter's family had embraced James with equal warmth. David and Carmen Castellanos, both educators who had immigrated from Mexico when Peter was a toddler, saw in James the stability and artistic vision that complemented their son's nurturing nature. David, a high school principal, appreciated James's work ethic and professionalism. Carmen, an elementary school counselor, loved the way James encouraged Peter's creativity and supported his teaching career. They were planning a future together, Carmen recalled. Not just the wedding and honeymoon, but real plans. James was saving money to open his own photography studio, and Peter was hoping to eventually become a principal like his father. They talked about traveling, about maybe adopting children someday, about growing old together. They had this beautiful vision of their life. The couple's engagement had been typically thoughtful and romantic. James proposed during a weekend camping trip to Point Reyes, at the lighthouse where they had taken their first photographs together as a couple. He had arranged with park rangers to have access to the lighthouse at sunset, and he proposed as the golden light reflected off the Pacific Ocean. Peter said yes before James had even finished asking the question. Their wedding planning reflected both their personalities and their financial constraints as young professionals. They chose a small ceremony at the Community United Church of Christ in the Castro, a congregation known for its welcoming attitude toward LGBTQ+ families. The reception was held at Peter's elementary school, which donated the space, with food provided by family and friends rather than a catering company. It was perfect for them, remembered Sarah Martinez, Peter's best friend and fellow teacher. Nothing fancy or pretentious, just surrounded by the people who loved them most. James took pictures of everything, and Peter made sure every single guest felt welcomed and appreciated. You could see how happy they were, how excited they were to start their married life together. The honeymoon had been Peter's idea, inspired by his love of history and James's passion for photography. They had spent months researching destinations that would offer both cultural richness and photographic opportunities while remaining within their modest budget. Eastern Europe, still relatively affordable for American travelers in 2001, seemed like the perfect choice. We want to see places that are real, Peter had explained to friends. Not just tourist attractions, but places where people actually live and work and have lived for centuries. James wants to photograph everyday life in these historic settings, and I want to learn about how these communities have survived and thrived through all the changes they've experienced. They spent countless evenings that summer poring over guidebooks, travel websites, and photography magazines, planning an itinerary that would take them through Prague, into the Czech countryside, then south through Slovakia and into Hungary. James researched the best locations for photography, while Peter investigated historical sites and cultural attractions. They learned basic phrases in Czech and Hungarian, practiced with maps and transportation schedules, and carefully budgeted every aspect of their trip. The planning process became almost as enjoyable as the anticipated trip itself. Friends would find them at coffee shops with maps spread across tables, debating the merits of different villages or discussing whether to splurge on a nice hotel in Budapest versus saving money for more days of travel. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and several friends began planning their own European adventures inspired by James and Peter's research. They approached the honeymoon the same way they approached everything else, observed Michael Chun, James's college roommate and closest friend. James would have all these detailed plans and backup plans, and Peter would be thinking about the people they would meet and the experiences they would have. Together, they created this perfect balance of organization and openness to adventure. The couple departed San Francisco on October 6, 2001, flying through Frankfurt to Prague on Lufthansa. Their families gathered at the airport to see them off, taking pictures and extracting promises for regular phone calls and postcards. Both James and Peter seemed almost overwhelmed by the excitement of finally beginning the adventure they had planned so carefully. "Call us when you land," Maria Rodriguez instructed, hugging her son tightly. "And take lots of pictures. I want to see everything when you get back." "We will," James promised. "I'm going to document the whole trip. When we get home, we'll have the most amazing slideshow for everyone." Peter's goodbye was characteristically warm, making sure to hug every family member individually and reminding them all how grateful he was for their support. "This is going to be the adventure of our lives," he told his parents. "I can't wait to tell you all about the people we meet and the places we see." They arrived in Prague on October 8th, after the long flights and connections that budget travel required. Despite their exhaustion, they were immediately enchanted by the city. Their first phone call home, made from their hotel room at the Golden Key, bubbled with excitement about the architecture, the history visible on every street corner, and their plans for exploring both the famous sites and the hidden corners of the city. The Hotel Golden Key was exactly what they had hoped for, a small family-run establishment in Prague's Old Town that catered to young budget travelers while maintaining old-world charm. Built in the 14th century as a merchant's house, the hotel retained much of its historical character while offering basic modern amenities. Their room was small but clean, with a window that looked out onto a narrow cobblestone street where they could watch daily life unfold below. Václav Novak, who worked the front desk during the day's shift, remembered the couple clearly even years later. They were very polite, very friendly, he recalled. Every morning they would stop at the desk to ask about directions or to confirm bus schedules. They had this guidebook they carried everywhere, and they would show me pictures of places they wanted to visit. They seemed very happy, very much in love. The hotel's guest registry, preserved in police files, documented their planned stay from October 8th through October 15th, with an option to extend if they decided to spend more time in Prague before heading to other countries. Room 312, their small double room on the third floor, became their base for exploring the city and planning day trips into the surrounding countryside. Their first few days in Prague followed the itinerary they had carefully planned back in San Francisco. They visited Prague Castle, walked across the Charles Bridge at sunrise to photograph it without crowds, explored the Jewish quarter, and spent hours in the Old Town Square watching the astronomical clock and the daily life of the city. James's photographs from these days, later recovered from their hotel room, showed not just the famous landmarks but the details that captured his artistic eye: weathered hands of street musicians, elderly women feeding pigeons, children playing in small parks. Peter's journal entries from their Prague days, written in his careful teacher's handwriting, revealed his delight in the human connections they were making despite language barriers. He wrote about the hotel clerk, who drew them detailed maps, the cafe owner who recommended his favorite local restaurant, the street vendor who taught them Czech words for different types of bread. "Everyone here has been so welcoming," Peter wrote on October 10th. "Language isn't really a barrier when people are kind." James took a beautiful photo today of an elderly man playing accordion near the cathedral. When James showed him the picture on the camera's display, the man's face just lit up. "We ended up sitting with him for an hour, sharing cookies from a bakery and trying to communicate with gestures and smiles. These are the moments I want to remember forever." James's photography during their Prague stay showed his growing confidence with the European light and architecture. He experimented with different times of day, capturing the warm morning light on Baroque facades and the dramatic shadows of late afternoon in narrow medieval streets. His technical notes, written on the back of photographs, revealed his excitement about the photographic opportunities and his plans for even better shots in the smaller villages they planned to visit. "The light here is completely different from California," James noted in his photography journal. "More golden, more dramatic. The architecture gives me so many opportunities for composition. I can't wait to see what the smaller villages look like, places where the light might be even more pure because there's less urban atmosphere to filter it." Their evening routine in Prague had become a comfortable ritual. They would return to the hotel in late afternoon, review the day's photographs and experiences, then venture out for dinner at small local restaurants that Václav had recommended. They avoided the tourist areas in the evenings, preferring neighborhoods where they could observe authentic Czech daily life. Maria Svobodova, who owned a small restaurant near their hotel, remembered serving them several times during their stay. "They were a nice couple," she recalled. "Very polite, always trying to speak Czech even though it was difficult for them. They would look at our family photos on the wall and ask questions about Prague history. The one with the camera, he took a picture of our restaurant that he showed us. It was very beautiful, much better than any picture we had." On October 11th, their fourth day in Prague, James and Peter began planning their first major day trip outside the city. They had identified a cluster of villages southeast of Prague that seemed to offer everything they were looking for: historical architecture, traditional rural life, and landscapes that would provide dramatic backdrops for James's photography. The area around Český Sternberg, with its medieval castle and surrounding farming communities, appeared perfect for their interests. The logistics of reaching these villages required careful planning. Unlike the well-developed tourist infrastructure connecting Prague to major destinations like Český Krumlov or Karlovy Vary, the smaller rural communities they wanted to visit were accessible only by a combination of train and local bus service. Schedules were infrequent, and missing connections could leave travelers stranded until the following day. Václav Novak spent considerable time helping them understand the transportation options. The route required taking a train from Prague's main station to Benisov, then connecting to a local bus that served the smaller villages. The bus service was limited, with only 3 departures per day and the last return connection leaving in late afternoon. I wrote everything down for them. Novak remembered. Train times, bus schedules, which stops to get off at for different villages. I told them to leave early in the morning and to make sure they caught the last bus back to Benisov. I warned them that if they missed the connections, they might have to spend the night in one of the villages, though I wasn't sure if there were hotels in such small places. James and Peter spent their evening of October 11th studying maps and finalizing their plans. Peter's journal entry from that night reflected their excitement about venturing beyond Prague's tourist areas into what they considered the real Czech Republic. "Tomorrow we're going to explore some villages that most Americans never see," Peter wrote. James found them in our guidebook, and they look like something from a fairy tale. Medieval castle, traditional farms, people who have lived the same way for generations. Václav at the hotel helped us figure out all the train and bus connections. It's going to be a long day, but I think it will be one of the most memorable parts of our whole trip. James's photography notes from that evening revealed his technical preparations for the day trip. He cleaned his camera lenses, loaded fresh rolls of film, and planned shot compositions based on photographs in their guidebook. He was particularly excited about the possibility of photographing rural life in golden autumn light, and he had identified several specific locations where he hoped to capture what he called authentic moments of Czech village life. "This is what I came here for," James wrote in his photography journal. "Tomorrow we get to see places that haven't changed much in centuries, photograph people living traditional lives in historic settings." The guidebook shows this incredible castle on a hill overlooking the river, surrounded by farms and small villages. If the weather is good, the light should be perfect for the kind of documentary photography I want to do. On the morning of October 12th, James and Peter woke early, excited about their adventure. They packed light for the day trip, taking only their green backpacks with camera equipment, the guidebook, water, snacks, and minimal personal items. They left their large suitcases in their hotel room, planning to return that evening and continue their stay in Prague for several more days before heading to other countries. Hotel records showed that they checked with the front desk about their return, confirming that their room would be held and that they planned to be back by late evening. They paid for an additional night and assured Václav that they understood the transportation schedules and timing required to make their return connections. "They seemed very prepared," Václav recalled. "They had written down all the information I had given them. They knew what trains and buses to take, and they had planned their day carefully. They were excited but not reckless. I had no concerns about their ability to handle the trip safely." The couple left the Hotel Golden Key at approximately 8:30 a.m. on October 12, 2001. Several hotel staff members noticed them departing because of their bright green backpacks, which stood out against the muted colors most travelers preferred. They seemed cheerful and confident as they walked toward the tram stop that would take them to Prague's main train station. That was the last confirmed sighting of James and Peter Rodriguez in Prague. They never returned to collect their belongings, never called to explain a change in plans, never made contact with their families or anyone else who knew them. They simply vanished, leaving behind only their suitcases in room 312 and the carefully planned itinerary that would lead investigators, eventually, to understand what had happened to them. The train from Prague to Benisov departed at 9:15 a.m., and railway records confirmed that 2 tickets purchased by Americans were used for that journey. The conductor, interviewed weeks later, had no specific memory of James and Peter, but thousands of passengers used the route regularly. And nothing about the couple would have made them particularly memorable during the routine morning journey. The train arrived in Benisov at 10:30 a.m., on schedule, and connected with the 11 a.m. bus to the rural villages. This is where the trail began to grow cold, though investigators wouldn't begin following it for several more days. The bus driver, František Novotný, remembered 2 young men with backpacks boarding his bus that morning, but his recollection was vague and influenced by the many similar passengers he transported regularly in the villages themselves. James and Peter seemed to vanish completely. Later investigation would reveal a few fragmentary sightings. a shopkeeper who remembered two Americans asking for directions, a farmer who noticed foreign tourists photographing his barn. But these accounts were incomplete and contradictory. What was certain was that somewhere in those peaceful-seeming rural communities, something terrible had happened to the young honeymooners. When James and Peter failed to return to the Hotel Golden Key that evening, the initial reaction was concern, rather than alarm. Budget travelers often changed plans spontaneously, and it was possible they had decided to extend their day trip into an overnight stay or had missed connections and been forced to find accommodation in one of the villages. Vaslav Novak checked their room the following morning, October 13th, and found all their belongings exactly as they had left them. Suitcases were neatly packed, personal items were arranged on the dresser, and there were no signs that they had returned during the night. Their passports, airline tickets, and most of their money remained in the room, suggesting they had carried only what was necessary for a day trip. By October 14th, with still no word from the couple, hotel staff began to worry seriously. James and Peter had been model guests, responsible and communicative, always informing the front desk of their plans. Their continued absence, particularly without any attempt to contact the hotel or extend their reservation, was completely out of character. The hotel contacted Prague police on October 15th, 3 full days after the couple's planned return. The initial police response revealed attitudes and assumptions that would plague the investigation from its very beginning. The reporting officer, Sergeant Tomas Svoboda, filed a routine missing persons report but seemed to view the matter as a minor administrative issue rather than a potential criminal investigation. It was not unusual for young tourists to change their plans without notice, Svoboda explained in later interviews. Especially American backpackers, who often travel with flexible schedules. We assumed they had met other travelers, decided to visit different areas, or had simply chosen to extend their stay in the countryside without informing their hotel. This assumption, shaped by stereotypes about American tourists and a fundamental misunderstanding of James and Peter's careful, responsible nature, led to a catastrophically inadequate initial investigation. Rather than immediately contacting authorities in the areas where the couple had planned to travel, Prague police simply filed paperwork and waited to see if the missing Americans would resurface on their own. The investigation that followed, or rather the lack thereof, would become a source of frustration and heartbreak for the families and a stark example of how prejudice and institutional indifference could allow serious crimes to go uninvestigated. Czech police made minimal effort to trace the couple's movements beyond confirming their train tickets to Benisov. No attempt was made to interview the bus driver who had transported them to the rural villages, to contact local authorities in those communities, or to conduct any systematic search of the areas they had planned to visit. Meanwhile, in California, the families were growing increasingly frantic as days passed without contact from James and Peter. The couple had been religious about maintaining communication during their travels, calling home every few days and sending regular postcards. Their sudden silence was alarming to everyone who knew them. David Castellanos, Peter's father, began making calls to American consular services in Prague within a week of losing contact with his son. As a high school principal, David was experienced in dealing with crises and bureaucracy, but he found himself frustrated by the limited assistance available and the apparent lack of urgency from Czech authorities. They kept telling us that adults have the right to travel freely, that maybe the boys had just decided to extend their trip, David recalled years later. But that wasn't James and Peter. They were responsible kids who understood that people worried about them. They would never just disappear without letting us know they were okay. Carmen Castellanos, Peter's mother, had maintained detailed contact with her son throughout the European trip, receiving long emails about their adventures and plans. The sudden end to this communication was particularly alarming to her because she knew Peter's habits and personality so well. Peter wrote to me almost every day, Carmen remembered. Long emails about the places they were seeing, the people they were meeting, the food they were trying. He would ask about his students, about family news, about his classroom. The idea that he would just stop writing, stop caring about what was happening at home, was impossible. I knew something terrible had happened. Maria Rodriguez, James's mother, began what would become a 12-year campaign to find answers about her son's disappearance. She contacted every American government office she could identify, wrote letters to Czech officials, and began building a network of other families dealing with missing American citizens abroad. "I knew James would never just disappear," Maria said. "He was the most responsible person I had ever known. Even as a child, he would call if he was going to be 5 minutes late coming home from school. The idea that he would travel to some foreign country and just vanish without a word was inconceivable." The American consulate in Prague assigned case officer Linda Morrison to work with the Rodriguez families. Morrison, a career diplomat with extensive experience in consular services, immediately recognized that the Czech police investigation was woefully inadequate. However, her ability to pressure for more thorough investigation was constrained by diplomatic protocols and Czech sovereignty over criminal investigations within their borders. This was clearly not a case of tourists simply changing their plans, Morrison observed years later. Everything about these young men's behavior, their careful planning, their regular contact with family, their responsible approach to travel, suggested that their disappearance was involuntary. But the Czech police seemed determined to treat it as a minor administrative matter. Morrison's diplomatic cables to Washington, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests years later, documented her growing frustration with Czech authorities' handling of the case. She noted that Prague police had failed to conduct even basic investigative steps, such as interviewing transportation personnel or contacting authorities in the areas where James and Peter had planned to travel. The consulate's ability to conduct independent investigation was severely limited. American officials could not compel Czech authorities to investigate more thoroughly, could not access Czech police files without permission, and could not conduct their own searches or interviews without explicit cooperation from local law enforcement. This bureaucratic paralysis led the families to hire private investigator Robert Chun, a former FBI agent who specialized in cases involving missing Americans abroad. Chun had worked extensively in Eastern Europe during the post-communist transition period and understood both the challenges and opportunities of conducting investigations in the region. Chun arrived in Prague in November 2001, 6 weeks after James and Peter's disappearance. By this time, the trail had grown significantly colder, but he was determined to conduct the thorough investigation that Czech authorities had failed to undertake. His first step was retracing the couple's documented movements from their hotel to the train station to Benisov and into the rural villages where they had planned to spend October 12th. The train journey from Prague to Benisov was straightforward, and railway personnel confirmed that tickets purchased by the missing Americans had been used on the morning of October 12th. However, from Benisov onward, the investigation became much more challenging. The local bus system was informal, with limited record-keeping and drivers who transported hundreds of passengers each week. František Novotný, the bus driver who worked the route to the rural villages on October 12th, remembered 2 young men with backpacks who might have been James and Peter, but his recollection was vague and unreliable. He recalled that they had seemed excited about their destination and had asked him to confirm stops for several villages they wanted to visit, but he could provide no other specific details in the villages themselves. Chin encountered a frustrating mixture of faded memories, language barriers, and what seemed like deliberate evasion. Some residents remembered seeing foreign tourists around the time James and Peter had visited, but accounts were contradictory and incomplete. Several people claimed no knowledge of any Americans visiting their communities during that period. 1. Of the few substantive leads Chun developed came from František Kratochvil, who operated a small guest house in one of the villages the couple had planned to visit. Kratochvil mentioned that in mid-October 2001, there had been some trouble in the area involving outsiders and local young men who were known for their hostility toward foreign visitors. There were some boys from Latovasis, Kratochvil explained, referring to a larger town about 20 kilometers away. They would come to our villages sometimes, especially when there were festivals or when tourists were visiting. They didn't like foreigners, especially if they thought the foreigners were different. When Chun pressed for more specific information about these individuals and the trouble they had caused, Kratochvil became evasive. He claimed not to know their names or exactly what incidents had occurred, and he seemed reluctant to discuss the matter with an outsider, even one working for the families of missing tourists. Other villagers Chun interviewed either claimed complete ignorance about any local tensions or provided vague, contradictory accounts that seemed designed to discourage further investigation. Several residents made it clear, either directly or through implication, that they preferred not to discuss incidents involving foreign visitors with someone they didn't know. Chin's investigation also revealed troubling attitudes toward LGBTQ+ individuals in the rural communities James and Peter had visited. While the Czech Republic had relatively progressive laws regarding sexual orientation, particularly in urban areas like Prague, rural communities often maintained much more conservative social attitudes. There was definitely hostility toward gay people in some of these villages, Chin noted in his investigative report. Not everyone, certainly, but enough people to create a dangerous environment for openly gay visitors. Some of the responses I got when I mentioned that the missing tourists were two men traveling together suggested that their relationship might have been viewed very negatively by certain local residents. Several villagers made comments that revealed deep-seated prejudices against homosexuality, often couched in religious or traditional terms. One elderly farmer told Chin directly that such people were not welcome in his community and that God punishes those who violate natural law. While such attitudes didn't constitute evidence of criminal activity, they painted a picture of an environment that could be dangerous for gay visitors. Chin's investigation was also hampered by the continued lack of cooperation from Czech authorities. Prague police refused to share their case files or to provide assistance with local interviews. Regional authorities in the areas where James and Peter had traveled claimed to have no knowledge of the missing Americans and showed little interest in helping with the investigation. I was essentially working alone, Chin recalled years later. The families had hired me to find out what had happened to their sons, but I was getting no cooperation from law enforcement, minimal assistance from local residents, and operating in communities where I was obviously viewed as an unwelcome outsider asking uncomfortable questions. Despite weeks of investigation, Chin was unable to develop concrete leads about James and Peter's fate. He confirmed their arrival in the rural area on October 12th, but could find no reliable witnesses to their activities after mid-afternoon. That day, his final report to the families concluded that the couple had almost certainly encountered violence, but he could not identify perpetrators or determine exactly what had occurred. Something terrible happened to those boys, Chin concluded. They didn't just decide to disappear or accidentally get lost. All the evidence points to them arriving in that rural area and then simply vanishing. That doesn't happen without someone knowing what occurred. The problem is getting people to talk, and in these communities, that's proving impossible. The case gradually faded from active investigation as 2001 turned to 2002. Czech authorities had effectively closed their inquiry, classifying James and Peter as missing persons who had likely left the country voluntarily. American diplomatic pressure continued, but without new evidence or witnesses, there was little momentum for renewed investigative efforts. The families refused to accept this conclusion. They organized awareness campaigns, created missing person websites, and maintained pressure on both American and Czech officials to keep the case active. Maria Rodriguez began corresponding with other families of missing Americans abroad, building a network of mutual support and shared advocacy. I never stopped believing that someday we would get answers, Maria said during one of the annual memorial services the families organized. I knew James and Peter were gone. I had accepted that, but I also knew that somewhere, someone knew what had happened to them. I prayed that eventually that truth would come to light. The case became part of the broader conversation about the safety of LGBTQ+ travelers in international destinations where social acceptance remained limited. Travel advisory organizations began including information about potential risks facing gay and lesbian tourists, using cases like the Rodriguez disappearance as cautionary examples. Peter's colleagues at Roosevelt Elementary School in Berkeley created a memorial reading garden in his honor, where his former students could remember their teacher and where his love of learning could continue to inspire others. James's artistic community in San Francisco organized annual photography exhibitions featuring his work, ensuring that his artistic vision would not be forgotten. Sarah Martinez, Peter's best friend and teaching colleague, became particularly active in pushing for continued investigation. She learned basic Czech, corresponded with journalists in Prague, and even organized a trip to the Czech Republic in 2005 to visit the areas where James and Peter had planned to travel. I couldn't accept that they were just gone, Martinez explained. These were two of the most wonderful people I had ever known. They deserved justice, and their families deserved answers. The idea that they could just vanish without anyone being held accountable was unbearable. Martinez's 2005 trip to the Czech Republic generated some local media attention, but no new investigative leads. She visited the villages where James and Peter had planned to travel, spoke with some of the same residents Chun had interviewed, and came away with the same frustrating sense that people knew more than they were willing to reveal. There was definitely something being hidden, Martinez observed after her return. People would start to say something, then stop themselves. There were meaningful looks exchanged, conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into rooms. Something had happened in that area, and the local community knew about it, but they were protecting whoever was responsible. As years passed, the case settled into a kind of suspended animation. The families had largely exhausted their legal and diplomatic options. Private investigators had reached dead ends, and Czech authorities showed no inclination to reopen their investigation. James and Peter's disappearance became one of those unsolved mysteries that occasionally surfaced in true crime forums or missing persons databases, but generated no new leads or official attention. The couple's friends in San Francisco and Berkeley organized annual memorial gatherings on the anniversary of their departure for Europe. These events became occasions not just for remembrance, but for advocacy, as attendees wrote letters to Czech officials and American representatives, urging continued attention to the case. Michael Chun, James's best friend from college, became a particularly vocal advocate for international cooperation in missing persons cases. He testified before congressional committees about the limitations American families faced when their loved ones disappeared abroad, using James and Peter's case as an example of how bureaucratic indifference could allow serious crimes to go uninvestigated. The system failed them completely, Chin argued in his congressional testimony. Two American citizens vanished in a foreign country, and nobody seemed to care enough to conduct a proper investigation. If this had happened in California, there would have been search teams, forensic analysis, systematic interviews with potential witnesses. Instead, we got bureaucratic excuses and cultural insensitivity. The transformation of the Czech Republic during the 2000s brought significant changes to the region where James and Peter had disappeared. European Union membership in 2004 led to increased economic development, improved infrastructure, and greater integration with Western European legal and law enforcement systems. These changes raised hopes among the families that improved international cooperation might lead to renewed investigation of the case. EU membership required Czech authorities to meet higher standards for criminal investigations and to cooperate more extensively with other member countries' law enforcement agencies. However, no such reinvestigation materialized. The case had grown too cold. The original investigators had moved on to other assignments or retired, and there seemed to be little institutional memory or interest in revisiting a 12-year-old missing persons case involving foreign tourists. By 2010, nearly a decade after James and Peter's disappearance, their families had reluctantly accepted that they might never learn what had happened to their loved ones. Maria Rodriguez, now in her 70s, had transitioned from active investigation to quiet commemoration, maintaining a memorial garden in her Oakland backyard where she kept photos from James and Peter's wedding and European travels. Carmen and David Castellanos established a scholarship fund at San Francisco State University for education students who demonstrated Peter's combination of academic excellence and commitment to working with underserved communities. The scholarship kept Peter's memory alive while helping other young teachers pursue the career he had loved. "We never stopped hoping for answers," Carmen said during one scholarship ceremony. "But we also knew that James and Peter would want us to focus on helping other people, on making something positive come from our loss." The scholarship students remind us of Peter's enthusiasm and dedication every year. The major infrastructure development that would eventually provide answers to these questions began in 2011, when the Czech Republic announced plans for a new bridge over the Vltava River southeast of Prague. The bridge was designed to improve transportation access to the rural villages that had become increasingly popular with day trippers and tourists, the same villages that James and Peter had planned to visit in October 2001. The engineering challenges of the bridge project were significant. The Vltava River in this area had steep banks and a complex underwater topography that would require extensive excavation and careful foundation work. The construction timeline called for beginning excavation in early 2012, with completion scheduled for 2014. Environmental impact studies conducted during the planning phase revealed that this section of the Vltava River had been relatively undisturbed for many years. The construction area was downstream from major urban development, but upstream from industrial facilities that might have caused significant pollution or sedimentation. This made it an ideal location for the bridge from an engineering perspective, but it also meant that any materials deposited in the river would have remained largely undisturbed over time. Tomas Vez, the construction foreman selected to oversee the bridge project, had over 20 years of experience with major infrastructure development throughout the Czech Republic. He was familiar with the archaeological discoveries that sometimes emerged during excavation projects, medieval pottery, ancient tools, and occasionally human remains from historical periods. "We always approached excavation work carefully," Vez explained years later. "You never knew what you might find when you started digging in areas that had been settled for centuries. We had archaeologists on standby, and we knew the procedures for handling historical discoveries." The excavation work began in March 2012, starting with the systematic removal of topsoil and vegetation from the construction site. The process was methodical and careful, both to preserve any archaeological materials and to ensure the stability of the bridge foundations that would be built on the cleared land. As the excavation progressed deeper, workers began uncovering layers of river sediment that had been deposited over decades. The process was like moving backward through time, each layer representing a different period in the river's history. Deeper layers contained older materials, including items that had been deposited during the communist era and even earlier periods. The work continued through 2012 without any unusual discoveries. Workers found the typical detritus of river sediment, organic matter, occasional pieces of pottery or metal that were clearly historical in nature, and the accumulated materials that naturally settled along riverbanks over time. Nothing suggested the presence of more recent or significant deposits. It was not until March 2013, nearly a year into the excavation process, that the discovery was made that would finally answer questions that had haunted two families for over a decade. The crew was working in a section of riverbed that had been particularly rich in sediment deposits, material that had accumulated over many years in a natural depression that had acted as a collection point for items carried downstream. Pavel Kosek, an experienced excavation worker who had been with the project since its beginning, was operating machinery to clear sediment from what would become the eastern foundation of the bridge. As the excavator removed layers of accumulated material, Kosek noticed something unusual in the sediment that didn't match the typical river deposits they had been finding. At first glance, it appeared to be fabric, which wasn't entirely uncommon in areas where people had been discarding waste over the years. However, as the excavator continued to carefully remove sediment, it became apparent that this was something much more significant than random debris. What emerged from 12 years of river sediment would transform the Rodriguez family's long search for answers from a painful mystery into an even more painful truth. The excavation had uncovered not just evidence of what had happened to James and Peter, but proof of the hatred that had motivated their murder and the systematic failures that had allowed their killers to escape justice for over a decade. The bright green backpacks that had made James and Peter so visible to hotel staff in Prague had also made them identifiable to construction workers pulling them from the river sediment 12 years later. Inside the packs, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of their river grave, investigators found personal belongings that immediately confirmed the backpack's owners. James's camera equipment was still recognizable, his careful notes about European light and photographic opportunities now water-stained but legible. Peter's guidebook remained intact, their planned itinerary still marked in his neat teacher's handwriting, the pages documenting their excitement about exploring traditional Czech villages. But the backpacks were not alone in the river. The careful excavation that followed their discovery revealed evidence that painted a horrific picture of what had actually occurred on October 12, 2001. James and Peter had not simply vanished or chosen to disappear. They had been brutally murdered, their bodies weighted down and thrown into the river along with their backpacks. The bright green color that had made them noticeable to Prague hotel staff ultimately serving as a beacon to uncover the truth of their fate. Forensic analysis of materials recovered from the riverbed revealed that both men had suffered significant trauma before their deaths, injuries consistent with a sustained assault by multiple attackers. The location where they were found, several kilometers downstream from the villages they had planned to visit, indicated they had been killed elsewhere and their bodies transported to this remote section of the river for disposal. Most disturbing of all was evidence that James and Peter had been specifically targeted because of their relationship. Items found with their remains included homophobic graffiti and symbols associated with extremist groups known to operate in rural areas of the Czech Republic during the early 2000s. The murder had not been random violence or robbery gone wrong. It had been a hate crime, carefully planned and executed by individuals who viewed the couple's presence in their community as an unacceptable violation of their values. The discovery forced Czech authorities to confront the reality that they had failed to investigate a brutal double murder, allowing the perpetrators to escape justice for over 12 years. The physical evidence recovered from the river, combined with renewed witness interviews, revealed that several residents of the rural communities James and Peter had visited were aware of what had occurred but had remained silent due to fear, complicity, or indifference to the fate of two foreign gay men. For Maria Rodriguez, the phone call from American consular officials came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in March 2013. She had been tending her memorial garden, the space where she had spent countless hours over the past 12 years remembering her son and hoping for answers. When the phone rang, she somehow knew immediately that this call would finally provide the truth she had been seeking, though that truth would prove more horrific than she had ever imagined. The families could finally lay their loved ones to rest, could finally understand what had happened during those final hours, and could finally see that justice might still be possible, even after so many years of silence and systematic failure. The bright green backpacks that had carried James and Peter's dreams of European adventure had ultimately carried the evidence that would expose the hatred that destroyed those dreams and the institutional indifference that had allowed their killers to believe they could escape consequences forever.